Now that I've had a chance to use it, I can definitely say this is a useful accessory no matter what your skill level is in film photography. So today we're going to be talking about something different. Today we're going to be talking about an accessory that personally I really didn't have any interest in until I had one sent to me to try out. But now that I've used it, I can definitely see the advantages, and it's going to become a permanent part of my film kit. So welcome back, guys. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like this video if you find it useful, and then comment below and tell me what you think of this particular meter we're going to be discussing, or the other available brands if you tried those as well. Let me know what you think and what your results were with them. I'm curious to see how the other ones stack up and compare. So today we're talking about external light meters. In particular, the one that I've been testing in the past couple weeks is the TT Artison external light meter. So first, I'm going to tell you why you don't need an external light meter and why you shouldn't get one. And then I'm going to tell you exactly why you do need an external light meter and why you should actually get one. So there's about 5 different variations of this from different brands, and they all have cold shoe mounts, and you mount them onto your camera. Then you simply pick your ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and get your light meter reading with this, and then transfer that onto your camera. Different models have some different features such as aperture priority, shutter priority, and we'll get into those when we discuss each individual model. So first, reasons why I didn't need one of these and why I didn't really see the need at the time to invest in one. First of all is price. The cheapest coming in at about $65, all the way up to, if you get the expensive Voigtlander version, which is basically identical to this, comes in about $225. Whereas if you have a film camera with a light meter in it, that's free, depending on, except of course for the cost of the camera. You have a digital camera, I'm sure, where you can check your lighting with. And then lastly, if you shoot a lot and you know how your cameras work, you're gonna know what settings you're gonna need for individual lighting situations, so you don't even really use a light meter depending on your skill level. So for me personally, I kinda had a mix of the 3. I was either using my phone to check lighting before I shot. If it's a camera that I have more experience with and I'm comfortable with, I would just pick my settings because I know how that camera on that film reacts. Or I would even use my digital camera if the lighting was a little bit trickier and I wanted to make sure my exposure was spot on. So personally, that's why I never bothered even investing into these. I had looked at several of them, but I just wasn't ready to pull the trigger and invest in one. Now, here are some reasons why you should buy an external light meter and why it is extremely useful. First, this being a cold shoe mount, you can transfer this onto any camera you have. So if you're constantly changing or trying out new cameras like me, you can pop this onto any different model, whether it has or does not have an existing light meter, to make sure that your exposure is correct. On that same point, me personally, I'm constantly testing cameras that I've bought, making sure they work, cleaning them, making sure they operate properly, making sure the exposure is accurate, and it's much easier to confirm all that with an external light meter than it is with the in-body meter. If it's something I'm cleaning up, I'm not even sure if it works properly. An example is I did a video a while back about the Minolta X700 versus the Canon A1 program. The X700 really struggles in low light, so your exposure is about 1.5 stops lower than what it should be. Half a stop to 1.5 stops depending. Whereas the Canon A1 program has a different light meter system, and so it is much better in low light. So with those 2 cameras, you're gonna get a very different setup and a very different reading. Using external meter, however, you're gonna get the same exact exposure no matter what camera you put it on. With old cameras, they could have broken light meters that are a little bit inaccurate, just bad light meters in general, or the shutter speeds could be off. Using this, it's gonna give you a much more consistent, accurate reading so you can pinpoint kind of where your problem is with whatever camera you're using. Next up is convenience. I've constantly been using my phone whenever I get into a tricky situation, or if I have my digital camera, sometimes I'll use that. But then you're constantly taking out your phone, unlocking your phone, going to the app, adjusting your settings, checking your exposures, and it just becomes a hassle. And if you're doing any kind of street photography or you're trying to move quickly, it really slows you down and you can miss good shots if you're constantly taking out your phone to check those meterings and then put it back in your pocket. This is small, compact, lightweight. It sits right on your camera. All you do is press the back button and it's going to tell you exactly what the exposure is, and you just adjust with the top dials. Now, in the short couple of weeks that I've used this, I can already tell it is a big time saver for me, and I should have invested in one of these a long time ago. I'm no longer checking my phone. I no longer have to go to my digital camera. No matter what camera I have, I'm confident I'm gonna get an accurate reading with this and make sure that the camera is working properly because I have a more accurate system attached to it. Now, for comparison's sake, there are 5 different variations of these cold shoe mounted light meters that I've come across. At the top of the list comes the Voigtlander external light meter. It's pretty much the same exact setup with this, with the dials. It takes 2 LR44 batteries. You have a shutter speed dial, an aperture dial, and then your ISO is mounted on top of the aperture. That one, the price tag comes in at $225, which is pretty expensive compared to this, which is about $60, which according to what I've been able to research and what I've been able to experiment with, this is going to give you basically the exact same exposure and exact same accuracy that $225 Voigtlander light meter will give you. Next up is the Doomo. The Doomo is, from looking at it, is identical to this TT Artison's light meter in every way. This takes the CR2032 battery, which is basically your watch battery, whereas the Doomo takes 2 LR44s. Other than that, from what I can see, it is identical in every way to this light meter, only it comes in at $120. Now between this and the 2 previous ones that I mentioned, you get the 2 dials for your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. You don't have any automatic settings, it is fully mechanical, there's no digital readout, anything like that. You have, of course, your lights up front and then a button in the back and the sensor up front that's going to read your lighting situation. So we'll get to the details of how this works after I go over these next 2 light meters. So next up is the V201X light meter. Now what's interesting about this is it has a rechargeable battery built into it. So it's charged by USB cable whenever you're not using it. It's got a completely digital readout and it does have aperture and shutter priority. It's nice that it's chargeable and you don't have to worry about batteries, but personally I'm not a big fan of the digital readout and I don't like having to navigate through a menu when I can just have dials to kind of quickly switch back and forth between the settings that I want, although it is nice to have aperture and shutter priority. So next is the Lime 1. Now the Lime 1 is very interesting because it has a hinge mount to it. So for example, if you're mounting it on something like a Rolly or any TLR, you have the flash mount on the side of the camera. So with that hinge mount, it allows you to mount the Lime 1 onto it and then turn it so your settings are up top and you can actually see what they are on a side mounted camera. So interesting concept, I like that. Personally, I have my Rolleiflex that I use all the time, so if it didn't have a meter built into it, that might be a nice option if I was strictly using it for that camera. The Lime 1 will also offer shutter and aperture priority as well. Now lastly is the Reveni. Now Reveni is the light meter that initially got me interested into the setup and made me contemplate investing into it. So the original Reveni external light meter has both aperture and shutter priority. It also offers exposure compensation and it is fully programmable. And lastly, it only takes 1 LR44 battery compared to the 2 that most others take. So what's interesting about the Reveni system is it's kind of become a modular setup. So you can kind of customize the system that you want on top of your film camera. So that part about it I like. It is 3D printed, so that is something to take into consideration, although I don't suspect it affects the quality whatsoever. Other things to note is that it is extremely small. Compared to this, it's just nothing but a small square. So even though this is no bigger than, a thumb's width each way, the Reveni actually is even more compact than this. I believe it's a little higher because of the way it stacks, but it's going to be even a smaller footprint than this TT Artison meter. The downside to that meter is that it has an LCD display and there's only 4 buttons I think on top of it, so you kind of have to know how to navigate through the menu and kind of figure out what you're changing. Obviously I'm not assuming it's too hard since you're really adjusting just ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, but it is one more kind of thing and step to take into consideration. Now the Reveni starts out at $125, and of course, as I said, you can kind of customize your setup, which is where the price is going to change. This is the TT Artison's light meter. Now this is the one I've been using, so I'm going to go over kind of the pros and cons to this meter and kind of why I think this is actually going to be the best option of those for me personally. First of all, it's got dials. I would much prefer dials over a digital layout because it's easier for me to kind of switch back and forth using these clicking dials to adjust my settings and get where I want to be. It's right there, I can see it, I don't have to scroll through menus or anything. Everything is visible right out of the gate. On the front, you have the sensor that's going to pick your lighting setup. On the back, you have the button which you will press in order to get your reading. And then on top, you have your 3 dials. So on the right-hand side, you have your shutter speed, which goes from 1 second all the way up to 2,000, which is going to cover you for basically any film camera, except for maybe, something like a Nikon FM2A or whatever. On the other side, you have your aperture. Now the aperture goes from 1 all the way to 22. Again, that's going to cover you for pretty much everything. ISO, of course, is mounted on top of the aperture dial, and that goes from 25 all the way up to 6400. So it might not get some of the really crazy low ISO films quite right, but otherwise it's going to cover you all through the spectrum. So how the metering system works: if the red minus sign is flashing, that means you are underexposed 2 or more stops. If the red plus sign is flashing, that means you are overexposed by 2 or more stops. If the green circle in the middle is lit up, of course that means you're perfectly exposed for whatever you're pointing at. Now, if you get a green circle and a red plus, that means you're overexposed by about 1 stop. If you get a red minus sign and the green plus, of course that means you're underexposed by about 1 stop, which depending on what film you're using, that's about perfect, unless you're shooting like a slide film and then you want to make sure you figure out how to adjust it in order to get that perfect exposure. So this came in a nice little box with a little screwdriver in order to get your battery in and out. The one kind of weird downside, iffy thing that I found out about putting a battery in this is it can be a little bit tricky to put it in there. You want to make sure you're careful so you don't snap anything when you're putting it in. And then also there's kind of an odd O-ring placement for one of these screws, which immediately falls out when you take it apart. Now I've reassembled it and I didn't put that O-ring back in here, and I'm not sure it really needs it. So for now it's in the box unless something happens. Not really sure what the point of it is that, but if you lose it, just know you probably don't need it, but just be prepared to have that fall out and lose it when you put a battery in it. Next up is I wish the shoe mount was adjustable. Now, I don't think that's a feature on any of the light meters we've discussed, but it is a nice perk to have, since with these old cameras, some of them are going to be a little more loose and some of them are going to fit differently. If you have a loose cold shoe mount or loose hot shoe mount, it would be nice to be able to kind of adjust this to make sure it's snug on there, so when you're walking around or whatever, it doesn't kind of flip right off. The last problem I have with this meter is with the dials. So the shutter speed is fantastic. It's clicked all the way through, so I know exactly when I'm changing each shutter speed. The aperture and ISO, however, are smooth. So for example, if you had it up to your face and you somehow nudged it, it could adjust by 1, 2, 3 stops and you wouldn't even know it. Since the shutter speed is clicked, it's not going to move at all, and I can adjust that and know exactly how many stops I've changed from my previous spot. ISO kind of moves pretty freely, so you want to make sure that's always consistent on whatever spot you have it set on, as well as the aperture. Again, it's not loose, it's not falling around, but it is something to consider, because if you rub it up against your shirt or your arm or your face, anything like that, you could adjust it by a stop or two. So that is something to take into consideration. So for me personally, the TT Artison light meter is going to be the one that I stick with. Why? Because it has the mechanical features that I personally love. In film photography in general, I want something quick, mechanical, that I can touch, feel, and get right on the point where I want it to, quickly and easily. Of course, there are 3 options for that: the Doomo, the Voigtlander, and the TT Artison. I will say I may look into the Reveni eventually, just because I do like the modular setup and some things they can do, but I will always have this in my back pocket for different situations, just because I love how it's set up. And then of course, the only other thing to compare between the 3 that have a mechanical setup is price. Again, the Voigtlander is $225, the Doomo came in at about $120, whereas the TT Artison comes in at under $65. And at that price, it is well worth it to remove the inconvenience of constantly taking out my phone or worrying about the internal light meter on a 50-year-old film camera, or having to pull out my digital camera to figure out the light reading that way. So if you're someone who's new to film and using an older camera that doesn't have an external meter, or maybe you have a bunch of different film cameras and you want something consistent across the board as far as exposure, or maybe you're like me and you're constantly buying, cleaning, repairing, and testing new cameras, and you just never know what your exposure is going to be, the TT Artison light meter is something you should definitely check out. Again, full disclosure, they did send me this, but they have no influence over the video, what I'm saying. They didn't pay me, anything like that. And if I didn't like it, trust me, I wouldn't mention it at all. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, leave those in the comments. I will be sure to get back to you on those. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.